tips that were illustrated with video for really basic things like starching fabric and even folding fabric, even washing fabric, which I didn't know how to do. And she was very creative, and after following her blog, I realized that she had a pretty productive attitude towards copyright or the idea of owning different designs. And I interviewed her for an article about quilting that I wrote for Tech Dirt several years ago.
Oh, that's really cool. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
That's
so
cool.
if you go to, in fact, let me see.
That's very cool.
Find that article.
Love it.
You go to Tech Dirt.
I love that.
techdirt.com, and let's see if anyway, she had been embroiled, like some people were sort of viciously attacking her. Some quilters were viciously attacking her, accusing her of copying something that they believed somebody owned, and that whole thing was just ridiculous.
That's really I found it. That's really cool. Right. It's interesting how she... the economics is really interesting, that she's monetizing it through the quilt shop, through products and not through the videos. And so it'll be really interesting to interview her.
Right. Which is exactly how you do it, right? Yeah. Like I published a thing at the time that said you use the unlimited resource to sell the limited resource. And she was just exactly...
That's really cool.
That's what she was doing.
Yeah. Tell me more about that strategy. I've been talking about consumables versus... Yeah, tell me about limited... Explain that philosophy.
Well, let's see.
Yeah.
We live in an age in which pretty much everybody has a copy machine at home connected to the internet. And the cost of copies is borne by the viewer, not by the producer. So the idea, oh man, where to even begin on this?
It's super important.
Another way I say it is attention is scarce, information is not. The idea that information is this really scarce resource that you have to cling to and sell is ridiculous, because it travels by copying, and that cost is not borne by the person who's putting out the information. It's borne by everybody who's viewing the information.
Right.
You make a copy of a newspaper at home, that's, you're paying for your electricity, your internet service, and your computer. You have paid for that. The person putting out the news is not paying for the copy. So making a business based on selling copies is very stupid in this age, unless those copies, or let's say making a business based on selling copies on people's computers is very stupid. You're
talking about like a pattern, right? So that right.
Yeah,
selling a pattern isn't necessarily the best way to go because it's easily reproducible.
Yes,
that's what you're saying, right?
Yes, and but when I made Sita Sings the Blues and released it, I did all these experiments for how to make money. And it seemed pretty clear to me that, I didn't want to sell people downloading the film, right? I wanted the film to be seen as many as people, by as many people as possible. But there was demand for DVDs. And people wanted me to sell them DVDs. And it costs money to make DVDs. It costs money to make physical copies of things. So I sold DVDs, and I could only make so many, and I had to pay for them up front. I have no problem selling DVDs. Some people would be confused. They'd be like, oh, but if your film is free, how come you're selling DVDs? It's like, because I made these copies of DVDs, and to be honest, they're a real pain in the ass to buy and store and ship. All that costs money. I would love it if I didn't have those expenses and people made their own copies, but since they're insisting on getting copies from me, great, I'll make a profit on that. And so basically things that are made of atoms cost money.
Right.
And things that are not made of atoms, they don't cost money.
Yeah.
Very simple.
And that it's much more difficult economically to control the non-atom products. So the idea is to think through a business model like what you were talking about with the DVDs or a physical book, where people are buying the fixed item, the item that's the physical item.
They're buying the scarce item or the limited item.
Yeah.
As opposed to the unlimited item.
Yeah, I think it's right, the unlimitedness of it. I also see when we've been chatting with, I've done 50 of these in a space of 4 weeks. So it's really interesting to think through where people are thriving and where they're not. And where I see people thriving is on what I'm calling consumables. So if it's printed on interface and you have to order another one, or if it's, these things that like get used up, that you need the physical aspect of it, or the personality. It's very much like the movie industry. I mean, the recording industry, the concert, right? So the class, the retreat, the superstar, that kind of like I get to meet so and so kind of thing. The experience, the quilt tourism. It's all what you're saying, the scarcity of being able to do that as opposed to the pattern. The patterns almost seem, I mean, there are people that want to make their living on patterns, and, I'm not telling them not to, but you see that those that are feeling confident and successful, it's because they make thread, or they do things that people need to continue to buy, and not the more intangible property.
Yeah. And time, of course, is also a limited resource. So like you were saying, that, doing talks and classes and things like that, that's totally worth paying for. People don't have unlimited time to give.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? It's so, we have all these copyright rules because it's the public goods problem. Once a song is out there, everybody else can sing it. So we have government come in to put in limitations so that you're allowed to sing it and someone else isn't allowed to sing it. But the internet has sort of broken that down in really interesting ways, that keeps that limited monopoly that is inauthentic from working very well, which is interesting, and that's what we're seeing here in this industry, as with every industry, that's what's happening.
Yeah, and of course, art and creativity long predates copyright. And art historically is people being influenced by other people, learning skills from other people, and copying other people.
Right.
And every time you copy something, it changes a little bit, and that's what culture is. And quilting, the irony for me, seeing the sort of protectiveness or the idea that people can own ideas in the quilting culture, that actually goes really against quilting, because quilting is a skill handed down over generations and transmitted mostly socially.
Yeah. Right.
By people observing and copying other people. And
it's fascinating, right?
Yeah.
It's fascinating. Yeah, and then, a couple of things come to mind. First, it's also such a great thing to study right now because it's got literally a public domain of building blocks that's a common language for everyone, which is remarkable. That doesn't happen in most fields. When you think about like all of the different, log cabin and all those different things, that's pretty cool. It's just really interesting. And then also this like hyper consumerist nature only really begins after the bicentennial. So it looks different, I think, in our 21st century world in the end of the 20th century than it did for most of its existence. So that's really interesting too, that you get that kind of there's a number of different competing cultural norms in a world that is about art and love and sharing and community. So it's interesting. Anyway, that's my take on it, at least so far. We're 6 months in, so that's my take on it. It's a complicated thing. I think everything's complicated, but it's got all of the complicatedness of what is our world at the moment. So
yeah,
with nice people and pretty things that are very warm and cuddly. So
one of the reasons I did get interested in quilting is because I had released Sita Sings the Blues this way, and I was watching Sita Sings the Blues go out in the world and thinking a lot about limited resources, and also thinking about the advent of the printing press and how books used to have to be individually copied.
right.
by hand. And that's what a quilt seemed like to me. It was this object that each one had to be individually made.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I got the Quilt Robot, and that was like an early printing press where, no, we can make more than one. It will take a long time.
Right. So tell us about the Quilt Robot. Tell me about that.
Oh, great. So in 2014, I guess, I finished this gig for this movie called The Prophet, Khalil Gibran's The Prophet, which had an actual sort of Hollywoodish budget. So I got paid some money. I just did one little segment of it. And I had hoped that money would be what I would be living on for the next several years while I made my film Sadomasochism. But you could no longer amortize your income on your taxes. So I had to pay incredibly high taxes, basically 50% of my income I had to just give to the government. The exception to that was business expenses. So I had this really high incentive to spend the money on business expenses. So it was like, well, is there some really expensive thing that you want or might want in the next 5 years? Buy it now.
That's so great.
And it was like, okay, a quilt robot.
That's really cool.
So that's why I bought the Quilt Robot.
I love it. Tell me about, what is the Quilt Robot? What is it? Tell us more about what the Quilt Robot is.
It's a quilt master. I, of course, was obsessed with sewing machines a few years ago. And I saw these things on eBay from this company. I think they're called Lancaster County Quilts. Mm-hmm. And they sell quilt masters. I was like, oh my gosh, that would be amazing. Actually, before I'd even saw it, I remember thinking that somebody should have a quilt plotter. I wanted a quilt plotter. Uh-huh. And there it was. And when I felt this pressure to spend a lot of money on business expense, my boyfriend at the time, Teo Gray, and I drove to Missouri and looked at the Quilt Master. And Teo, who is one of the founders and original designers of this software called Mathematica, he was super fascinated with it. And he told me that if I did quiltimation, he would, work on the coding for what goes into the machines. We had actually bought an embroidery machine that same year. It started with the embroidery machine. I think the embroidery machine came before the quilt plotter. Actually, I'm not really sure. Anyway, so he did the outputting of the files that these machines read, which is a really non-trivial thing because stitching software is also really horrible and also really backwards and also really crippled by copyright issues that prevent any significant innovation happening in those fields. It's actually kind of heartbreaking that there's this amazing hardware people can use, and the software side of it is just absolutely crippled.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
All right. So your stuff is insanely amazing. Like, not just a little bit amazing, but like out of this world amazing. Is this so? And I'll put a link so people can look at it. But it's the Quilt Master. Is it considered a long arm, or is it something different than a long arm?
It's not a long arm. It's a quilt plotter. Actually, the bad thing about the Quilt Master is you can only use it as a quilt plotter. I really would love something that I could use by hand and also put it on auto. But it's just a plotter. It only runs automatically. And I mean, that's a physical limitation of it. If you see this thing, there's just no way.
Yeah, it looks huge. Yeah. Is it huge?
Yeah, it's huge.
So
yeah,
cool.
So basically I took this art form that I started doing because I wanted to work with my hands and was sick of working on the computer. And I eventually got to the point where I stopped working with my hands and it was all on the computer.
Back on the computer.
That was part of my secret plan, though, because I wanted to start animating again because I had this film Sadomasochism I wanted to finish. And I kept not doing any animation because I wanted to quilt all the time. And I figured if I invested that much in quilting, I would eventually want to get away from quilting and get back into animation. And I succeeded.